I am this year's 2022 president of Smart Coast California, and I'm also honored to be the host today for this Humboldt County Sea Level Rise Summit. We're very excited to have all of our guest speakers here today, and I'll be introducing them here in just a moment. But thank you all for your time. This is very important, I know, to every one of us, whether we live on the coast or we enjoy the coast. I think we all have the same desire, and that is to make sure that the coast is there for generations to come. So thank you for your participation today. Krista, you want to start the slide? I'd like to introduce you to our 2022 Board of Directors. This group has been phenomenal this year. We've chosen a new slate for 2023 that will start January 1st. Paul Grisanti will be our president next year. Very excited to have him on board and leading the group Smart Coast California next year. We've gone from 16 directors down to 11 next year, but we are covering the entire coast of the state of California. For those of you that were not at our policy summit that we held in person at the West End Long Beach, it was a phenomenal event. Lots of positive feedback, which is why we're doing these virtual summits now, being able to be more focused on individual communities and counties rather than having everybody from all over the state come to one place. Very excited to be ready for next year's summit. I believe it'll be at Long Beach. We're still working out dates, but next year we will be having a 2-day event. So stay tuned for information on that on our website. So our program outline today is the people that are on the board here now. Mike Wilson, 3rd District County Supervisor, California Coastal Commissioner, and including Aldrin Laird, Senior Environmental Planner. They'll be our first ones to speak. Michael Richardson, Humboldt County Supervising Planner. Regional feasibility study is what he's going to be discussing. David Loya, Arcata Director of Community Development. He'll be talking on coastal plans on the local level. And then our consultant, Don Schmitz, with Schmitz and Associates, and he'll be talking about the statewide SLR planning activity. And then I'll close it up with closing statements, and then we will give everybody that's participating time at the end to ask questions of all of our speakers. So if you have questions, put them into the chat, save them, and we'll discuss them at the end of the speaking. With that, Mike, I'd like to let you take over.
All right, thank you very much. Can people see and hear me, I guess? So they'll have to ask this question. Am I there?
You are.
You're here.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Good to know. Good to know. Thank you for letting me know. Hello there, everybody. This is Supervisor Mike Wilson here in Humboldt County. I'm here speaking to you from Arcata, California. I am a commissioner on the California Coastal Commission. I was appointed by the governor in 2019 to represent or basically be the seat that represents the North Coast, which is Humboldt, Del Norte, and Mendocino counties. And I'm not sure how much of a primer we need to do with relationship to the Coastal Commission and the Coastal Act, but I'll just give you the briefest summary that I can do at this moment, which is the Coastal Act came from an initiative, a citizen initiative in 1972, Prop 20. It was in response to folks that were feeling that, quite frankly, local governance wasn't protecting coastal resources in a way that allows for the enjoyment and preservation with relationship to those resources, whether it be access or view sheds or water quality or wildlife and all of those things. There was a movement that all of those assets, those natural resource assets, had public benefit and public ownership and needed representation from a state level. And so that's really how it was born. The Coastal Act was born from that effort. And embedded in that is, frankly, the sort of the conflict that we are always negotiating in this with relationship to these public trust resources and how we manage those for the entire state, whether you live in Modoc County, Santa Cruz County, Sierra County, or Orange County. These are for everybody. And so that is in what creates sort of this conflict that we are always trying to manage in this case. And so it's sort of born also of the fact that, local governance in general, and as we all sort of experience if you look at planning commissions and city councils and boards of supervisors, generally folks that either own property, manage property, or have attachments to those fundamental issues are the ones that are predominantly in those decision-making processes. And again, sort of tilt those decision-making processes quite a bit, or have in the past anyway. And so again, that's sort of that conflict that we're trying to mitigate for in these situations. With sea level rise, things have definitely shifted, and the playing field, or not the playing field, but the jurisdictional boundaries and sort of the physical parameters by which we manage some of these resources is changing due to the forces of nature and the impacts of sea level rise from climate change. And so that's one of the reasons why we've been having a lot of these discussions, and why we're here today. So in the slide you see in front of you, this is the current California Coastal Commissioners. These are actually, I'm looking at, these are the voting members. We have 3 non-voting members as well, represented by various agencies. And we'll take the next slide. This is the Board of Supervisors for Humboldt County, in case you didn't know. And then here we have a sea level rise local government working group. So I'll bring this up in that, we've been having a lot of these discussions about trying to mitigate and trying to work on a lot of these issues, because they're so cross-jurisdictional with relationship to sea level rise and these conflicts that we are trying to deal with relationship to local governments. So these are the folks that are diving into this conflict and trying to really work it out, do the hard work of that. And I don't know how up to date this is. Actually, it looks like there's a few folks that maybe have changed here and there, but more or less you can see, next slide, you'll see you'll see where where most of these folks come from in various parts of the state. And the local governments with relationship to the League of Cities has a coastal committee, and they have assigned a couple of folks to be on this working group. And CSAC, which is the California, basically the county's version of the League of Cities, is basically also has a county, or has a coastal group that has assigned a few folks, and we meet quite regularly, once a month, to really work on some of the issues that we see, not just on an individual project level, and really we're looking at it sort of from programmatic level and trying to really figure a lot of that stuff out. So I'm just going to focus what I'm going to talk about just for a couple of minutes on what that group's been working on, and then I'll let our local planner Aldron Laird sort of talk specifically more about sort of sea level rise issues in Humboldt Bay area. And I want to emphasize the North Coast is extremely different than the rest of the state, as my experience with relationship to sea level rise, for sure, because we don't have a Manhattan Beach, and we don't have we don't have those places where you have lineups of $6 and $7 million houses, one after another, after another, after another, which really, or eroding cliffs with, big mansions on it, or those sorts of things. Like we have some private properties that will definitely be impacted by sea level rise, but but mostly what is concerning most of us is around public resources or public infrastructure. And of course, the private properties are of great concern to us, but it's just not in the same scale financially that we see in the southern end of the state. And they're also not as tightly close together necessarily for the most part. So the Sea Level Rise Working Group convened first in 2018, and the goal was to really look at adapting sea level rise and local coastal program updates to be more predictable. So this is sort of what we're kind of looking at, what we're trying to get into. So the working group, which I mentioned before, really seeks to explore the strategies and maintain statewide consistency in protecting coastal resources. And in August of 2022, so that's this year, we actually conducted a local government workshop at our meeting in Carlsbad. And it was a focus on conflict resolution process within the local coastal plan processes, and trying to figure out ways that we can actually, calm it down a little bit, and then also get our agencies all talking and farther ahead of time to get these local coastal plan updates done, because we really need to get them done. The guidelines for a phased approach for LCPs. So we really have been talking more about phased approaches for local coastal plans. And there's been a lot of evolution in that. And I'm very happy to report that that's definitely something that's been moving forward, and a commitment to developing some regional approaches. And what I mean by that is less trying to, a lot of permits that come to the Coastal Commission are on a parcel by parcel basis, and we often see that is a very difficult way to manage for sea level rise when one parcel is moving forward with a permit to protect itself or adapt to or do whatever it is relative to sea level rise, and the parcel next door isn't or hasn't gotten there yet, and or for whatever reason. So we are starting to really think about what those regional and some might call neighborhood approaches might be for that. We know that piecemeal approach to planning needs to be improved, and the parcel by planning is very difficult. And so we're just going to really work on how that we can try and protect and even enhance these values within the Coastal Act that we're supposed to do, and while at the same time work on trying to do more neighborhood approaches to these responses on a physical level and programmatic level. So some of the things that we've been thinking about is working on is, about the uncertainty about the timing and the impacts of sea level rise. And I think there's, there's a lot of discussions in that, and there's some variability within that. The legal and regulatory risks that regarding takings, repetitive loss, circumstances in which shoreline protected devices may or may not be allowed by law. Those are all issues we're dealing with. Challenges around how to coordinate infrastructure planning, and that's something that Humboldt Bay is really working on. And how to effectively phase different adaptation approaches in response to changing conditions. Again, talking more and more about phased approaches. So we're focusing a lot on what one might call neighborhood scale approaches, and looking at not necessarily parcel by parcel, but also just not like huge swaths of the coast, but like kind of getting into those zones. Like we had some, and so what I want to focus on is just for a minute is that within that framework, the Coastal Commission does have significant funding for local governments currently. Humboldt County just recently applied for over $1 million to address regional planning needs, and I believe the city of Eureka and city of Arcata are also looking at some of those grants. And that also the commission is expanding its LCP grant maximum amount in terms of it's the grants that it can distribute without a lot of process, from 100,000 to $500,000 in November, if our board approves that upgrade. So the rolling grants, which are a non-competitive process, will be really quite available to everybody. So other points that could be made from my perspective is that it's important for the community through, you know, a community member participation. We need to really work on the vision, not just neighborhood wide, but region wide, about what sea level rise will do to change the landscape. And that's really for Humboldt Bay area and in our North Coast, because in Humboldt Bay, we have very big areas that will, you know, have impact. And we're gonna have to really focus on what those impacts are. And it's not just the highway that we have in Humboldt Bay, which Alderon will show you, but also the wastewater treatment plant projects, and not just Arcata, but Eureka, and those we'll talk about those too. So those are my thoughts. That's what I have for you in this moment. And so I will pass it to Alderon Laird.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike. I have a number of slides to go through and not very much time, so let's get started and move on to the first slide. So I wanted to start off with the historical conditions on Humboldt Bay. It's important, I think, for people that aren't familiar with the area to realize that Humboldt Bay used to be surrounded with extensive salt marsh plains to the north and to the east. If you could go to the next slide. And today, those salt marsh plains are no longer there. What we have now is generally grazing pasture in the location of former salt marsh areas. And over the last 45 years, our annual high water events are consistently going up. And if we can go to the next slide. We are already experiencing tidal flooding during king tide events around the bay in some of our disadvantaged communities. And the type of sea level rise impacts that we're expecting to occur on Humboldt Bay, if we could go to the next slide. The shoreline erosion and breaching, and the next slide. Tidal inundation of low-lying areas, and the next slide. Stormwater runoff and backwater flooding around the bay, and the next slide. And most importantly, emerging groundwater in low-lying areas surrounding the bay. If we go to the next slide, you can see that most of the area that used to be salt marsh that was around the bay is the area that's most vulnerable and at risk from emerging groundwater. And so if we could go to the next slide. Humboldt Bay is unique. The commission is often referred to our area as ground zero for sea level rise, and this is one reason why. When you look at the NOAA tide gauges on the west coast, Humboldt Bay has the highest rate of sea level rise on the entire west coast at the North Spit tide gauge. But when you go to the next slide, you can see that just to the south of the tide gauge in South Bay and our neighbor Eel River Delta, we already have extreme tides overtopping dune ecosystems and flooding low-lying former tidelands that are agricultural zones. So we're experiencing a good amount of flooding now. And NOAA has just released a 2022 study where the North Spit, they think that the number of flood days can go from 5 to 10, what we see now, to 45 to 75 flood days in the course of a year. So if we go to the next slide. One thing that we had occur back in 2005, the governor declared a state of disaster during a king tide and a storm event, and we had an extreme water elevation of 9.6 feet. And if you go to the next slide, that's become our baseline for measurement, that state of disaster water elevation of 9.6 feet. With 1 foot of sea level rise, our average king tide will exceed that water level. And with 2 feet of sea level rise, our monthly high tides will exceed that level that resulted in a state of disaster. And with 3 feet of sea level rise, even our daily high tides will reach that water elevation that resulted in a state of disaster being declared on Humboldt Bay. If we go to the next slide. On Humboldt Bay, we're fortunate in that we have a local engineer and hydrologist who created a three-dimensional model or a hydrodynamic model of Humboldt Bay. And if you go to the next slide, that's enabled us to identify, he produced maps in half-meter intervals of the entire bay. So now we can see what areas, based on existing surface topography, would be inundated by what water elevations. And with that information, we've been able to analyze what type of infrastructure or uses might be at risk. But one of the things that we discovered early on in doing our sea level rise work is, if you go to the next slide, is that we've inherited a historical legacy of diking off of the salt marsh. The next slide. There's approximately 41 miles now of dike shoreline, and we have removed about 7,000 to 8,000 acres of former salt marsh from the bay. If we go to the next slide. We've created a shoreline elevation profile, which enabled us to identify that there's actually a tipping point on the dike shorelines of Humboldt Bay, that when water elevation increases from 2 to 3 feet, we could have up to 50% of all of our dike shorelines being overtopped with that. If we go to the next slide. The county undertook a dike shoreline sea level rise adaptation feasibility study, and they identified, if we go to the next slide, that there are 24 dike shoreline areas on Humboldt Bay based on existing conditions. And they identified and logged how many or what type of utility and transportation infrastructure are being protected by each of these dike shorelines in these hydrologic areas, so that we could identify which of the 24 diked areas, there's about 12, that could be high priority areas for doing resiliency work to protect utility and transportation infrastructure. If we go to the next slide. The study also identified some possible ways of rebuilding dikes in place and creating living shorelines to increase salt marsh habitat and avoid the need for rock fortification, or to abandon the existing dikes and create barrier island wildlife habitat and relocate the dikes inland at a higher elevation to protect the inland areas from tidal inundation, as well as restoring salt marsh. These are expensive options of $2 to $3 million a mile, though. Can we go to the next option? Next slide. The other historical legacy that we uncovered with our vulnerability studies, if you go to the next slide, is that in the construction of the jetties starting in the 1890s to stabilize the navigation channel into Humboldt Bay, it ended up funneling all the wave energy through the jetties and on the opposing shoreline. And in the first 60 years of the construction of the jetties, the shoreline retreated 1,500 feet. And if you go to the next slide. And that shoreline retreat was stopped by a shoreline fortification that PG&E constructed in the 1950s, but it's currently now at the limit of our storm surges, and king tides are overtopping that shoreline fortification. And if you go to the next slide. Unfortunately, PG&E stored their nuclear fuels when they decommissioned the nuclear power plant just 115 feet back from that fortified shoreline that is opposing the entrance or the jetties. It's the most vulnerable shoreline in the entire bay as far as shoreline retreat and erosion. In the next slide. So the county took the shoreline sea level rise vulnerability studies. There's about a dozen that have been done in our region, and put all that data together and then stratified the data based on critical assets like utility infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, land uses. And they looked at the distribution of those assets and their vulnerability based on hydrologic units rather than looking at land use jurisdictions. And if we go to the next slide. And what they have found is that with utility infrastructure like wastewater lift stations and pump stations, sewer lines, and the next slide, please, municipal water lines and pump stations, that we now know how many miles of those type of infrastructures are vulnerable in which localities and under whose jurisdiction. So it's taken a regional approach to looking at the vulnerability and risk of infrastructure rather than looking at it based on jurisdiction. And if we go to the next slide. And they produced maps that identify each of these, say, utility infrastructures or transportation infrastructures. We looked at underground gas lines, electrical transmission towers, municipal water lines, sewer lines, lift and pump stations, optical fiber lines. All of this has been mapped and quantified so that it enables the local coastal program authorities to use this information to do their planning on a regional basis. And if we go to the next slide. We have many local roads as well as regional state highways that are at risk, and these have also been included in that bay-wide documentation. The next slide. And in closing, I wanted to highlight that we have some disadvantaged communities in the unincorporated area of the county that are in the near term are really at risk from rising water elevations. We have the community of King Salmon and Fields Landing. Both of these areas will be severely impacted, in the near term with not a lot of water elevation just because of their locality and how they were constructed. If we go to the next slide. And we also have, there's 3 different areas of Highway 101, which is a critical transportation corridor. Caltrans is presently focused on the middle section of that on Humboldt Bay between Eureka and Arcata. But in the South Bay, we actually is the most vulnerable section to the Highway 101 in the near term with 0.5 meter of sea level rise. The existing dike could be overtopped. If it was overtopped, the existing highway grade would be inundated with sea level rise. And Caltrans is currently not focused in this region. It's focused in a different area. We need to look at the totality of assets and their vulnerability in the Humboldt Bay region and in the Eel River Delta, and not just focus on individual specific projects. And to the last slide. Lastly, just recently, the Humboldt Area Hazard Mitigation Plan decided to look at sea level rise along with its other flood hazard components. And looking at 3 feet of sea level rise in the county assessor maps, they identified parcels that would be inundated with 3 feet of sea level rise and determined there would be 620 people possibly exposed, 290 structures, and the property and development value today is about $396 million that would be at risk. With 8 feet of sea level rise, that jumps up to about 2,600 people being exposed, about 1,200 structures exposed, and the property and development value of $2.3 billion. And so our area has some severe exposure. There's a lot of infrastructure, critical infrastructure that's vulnerable and at risk. And as a rural, small area, we are certainly going to need outside assistance from the state and federal government to help with regional planning. And I'll end with that. And thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Michael Richardson. Michael's going to be talking on the regional feasibility study.
Yes, thank you. Next slide, please. Here's an overview of my presentation. First, going to show some maps of Humboldt Bay. Second, I'll go into some of what Alderon talked about, which is the result of a grant that we received from the Coastal Commission exploring feasibility of sea level rise planning on Humboldt Bay. And then the third part of my presentation will be to just give you a brief snapshot of what we hope to accomplish in this 2022 grant application if we get funded. Next slide, please. Okay, here's a map showing the Humboldt Bay region, and Highway 101 is shown in red, running from north to south, from top to bottom. Highway 299 is going off to the right, and Highway 255 circumnavigates the northern part of the bay. With the blue line, you could see the edge of the coastal zone, and so everything to the left of that blue line, the ocean side of that blue line, is the coastal zone, and everything to the right is outside of the coastal zone. Within the coastal zone, the Coastal Commission is going to have some jurisdiction over what happens there outside of the coastal zone. To the right of that blue line, it's up to the local jurisdictions to decide how they approve development. Next slide, please. Yeah, there you go. The city of Arcata is shown in gray here, and Eureka is shown in, they're both shown in gray. And next slide. Here's a close-up of the city of Eureka where the coastal zone boundary, excuse me, where the coastal zone boundary lies. And Dave Loyal will be picking up on this after my presentation. Next slide. And then here's a close-up of the city of Eureka. And the coastal zone boundary here. You can see in this slide, there are some large developed areas with roads and infrastructure that are outside, just outside of the city limits of the city of Eureka, where there's a handoff between the city and the county in permitting development. So within the city boundaries, the city is going to issue permits for development, and then on the other side of the street, literally, in some cases, the county's going to pick up that responsibility. And so you can kind of get a sense from this map how it makes sense for both the city and the county to be operating from the same playbook when it comes to adopting or adapting to sea level rise, where the impacts are going to be on either side of the jurisdiction boundary. They're going to be the same for homes and businesses. Next slide. The 2029 grant that's drawing to a close here pretty soon. We hope to be completed with all the deliverables by the end of this year. It explores whether it might make sense to address the risk of sea level rise through cooperative and coordinated regional approach. And we could apply this approach to identification of adaptation measures, funding, and implementation of projects. Next slide. The regional approach makes sense in some ways. It's being used successfully for roads and trails and other infrastructure projects. We're also coordinating regionally on a climate action plan, and that's actually resulted in us being able to secure $275,000 for environmental review of this climate action plan. That would not be available unless we were taking a regional approach. And so there are definitely some financial benefits to this regional approach that we're exploring. Next slide. The first deliverable in the first chapter of this feasibility study is the stakeholder catalog, and that's available on our website. Alderon just talked a lot about some of the assets and the mapping that's done on a hydrologic unit basis. The catalog identifies all the owners, managers, and other parties that may be involved in a regional effort. It provides information about the assets they own or manage in other areas of interest. Next slide. It covers 6 topic areas, and these are kind of opening questions for each of the asset managers that is described in the catalog. Who's managing and maintaining the shoreline? How is it being managed and maintained? What changes are needed to accommodate sea level rise? And next slide. Can I go to the next slide? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Back up one. Thank you. And then the property ownership, who owns the property, how will adaptation measures on one property affect other properties, and who's going to take the lead in this. Next slide. Regulatory authority and compliance. Can we get permits to implement these measures, and can we coordinate the permits of various agencies? Next slide. How do we address sea level rise impacts? How do we decide which projects to go forward first? Next slide. How should it be funded? And next slide. And then, given all of these impacts, what are the implications for each of the various assets? Next slide. We've got also embedded in this catalog the results of a couple of different surveys. We surveyed property owners that could be impacted by a meter of sea level rise, as well as the general public. And then we've also got another survey, separate survey of just coastal professionals. And these survey results are kind of blended into the discussion of all of the different assets and owners and responsible agencies. Next slide. The second chapter, we just released a draft of. It's being reviewed by all of the various agencies, and it evaluates how different approaches and frameworks may support sea level rise protection, accommodation, retreat strategies. Next slide. And so it looks at what are the potential frameworks we might use, how might jurisdictions coordinate across their boundaries, what are the funding opportunities and the frameworks that we would need to put in place for that, and what are the regulatory pathways and barriers. Next slide. And then based on all of this information, or informed by all of this information, we're putting forward a grant that would take it to the next level and actually adopt or develop a strategy for sea level rise adaptation. We're proposing a mutual gains approach where all the agencies involved are going to realize the benefits of this coordinated approach. All of the impacts are equitably dispersed, and they're all understood by the stakeholders. So we're kind of a heads up format for this proposed grant. Next slide. There are three major components that we're hoping to tackle with this new grant application. First, we've got the critical one. This is the heavy lift, building the organizational and regulatory framework for the adaptation strategy. We're proposing a phased approach with thresholds that trigger future policy planning review, LCP updates and projects, and there's a three-year time frame for this grant. It's a pretty ambitious grant. The second, next slide. The second part of the application, and this would be implemented concurrent with that first part, is a series of technical studies to support the phased approach that we're proposing. So economic, engineering, biological, cultural resource studies to inform that strategy. And then the last slide. And here's the last part of it. I'm not sure there's going to be a major task. This will be kind of a sidebar task, which is to incorporate the regional climate action plan measures into the local coastal plans. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Michael, very much. I appreciate it. All right, next up, David Loyola. David, you're gonna present your own. There you go. Looks good.
All right, thank you, Joe, and thank you, Michael, Alderon, and Mike for those presentations. I think it's a really important topic, and that's evidenced, I think, by the great turnout that we have today. My name is David Loy. I'm the Director of Community Development. Wanted to provide you my contact information because this is a fairly quick presentation, and really the way I see this is it's an opportunity for me to connect with folks that are interested in this topic and want to be involved. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that we're engaged in right now. Real briefly on sea level rise, I think Alderon's presentation really covered it in great detail. And so I'm going to piggyback onto a little bit of his expertise and wisdom. And then we're going to talk briefly about how the city of Arcata is approaching that with its local zoning and adaptation planning. I do think it's important to recognize the work that Michael pointed out, the regional work that we're doing is an important piece to this too, but I am going to focus strictly on what the city of Arcata is doing. I'm going to do a very high level overpass on the journey. So our current local coastal program was adopted in 1989. The zoning was adopted in 1994. And so to Commissioner Wilson's point, this document is in dire need of updating. We've been working on it for quite some time, since 2000 at least, and this work has been supported by the Coastal Commission with a couple of grants that we've received to do this work. Really happy with the coordination and collaboration that we're getting with the Coastal Commission. We recently applied for a 22 grant and are looking forward to hopefully receiving that and then bringing our local coastal planning to a close sometime here in 24. So again, just real high level, we've been doing a lot of outreach and engagement on this. We have, it comes in waves, no pun intended, but we're going to be picking up our engagement over the course of the next 6 months and really invite people to reach out to us, get involved, and participate. Okay, so getting to sea level rise, the protagonist, this is where you can boo and hiss. I'm going to show you a little bit more detail on the city of Arcata's 1870 shoreline. Alderon showed this before, but I just want to get everybody to orient to this. The blue is the mapped 1870 shoreline. We have the Arcata bottoms on large parts of this. Here's downtown Arcata right here. And this is outside the city limits, but you can see a large portion of this was tidally influenced previously. And as Alderon spoke, there were salt marshes outside of that area. Some of the work that Alderon has done in his vulnerability studies has pointed out that if the dikes were breached today, the 1870 shoreline would be approximately the today shoreline. So that's an important theme to think about as we look at what our responses to sea level rise should be. We've done a ton of work on the vulnerability studies. We worked with Northern Hydrology. We've worked with Alderon Laird. This was a number of years ago. There's been a lot of updates since then with the state and federal levels. The science of this is constantly changing, and we're constantly staying apprised of those changes and working to try and update our sea level rise policy as we get that information. But I did want to show you what 2 meters of sea level rise would look like in our community. This is 6 feet of sea level rise based on the NOAA mapper if we did absolutely nothing. Now this maps on real closely to that 1870 shoreline. You can see a large part of our South G Street is underwater. The wastewater treatment plant is underwater. People's homes, people's businesses. But we've also got large swaths of area that were either acquired by the city or through zoning were preserved in agricultural uses. And so that's going to key into our adaptation strategy, just recognizing that. Again, with 6 feet of sea level rise, the direct inundation from tidal waters doesn't quite hit the core of the city. But it's important to note, as Alderon spoke, that the city will be dealing with backwater flooding, groundwater issues, and all of those things. So we're aware of and working to deal with those as well. So what are we doing about it? What's our adaptation strategy? In general, super high level, the way I would describe it is that the plan is to accommodate for these rising tides where we can do that. Where it's not feasible to just accommodate immediately, we'd like to defend for as long as it's feasible to do that. When it's not feasible to do that, we realize that we need to retreat. So a lot of people call this managed retreat, or sometimes we refer to it as measured retreat. I want to talk to you a little bit about how we're planning to implement that measured retreat. And also the effect that we'll continue to use zoning to have that effect on our community. Alderon had pointed out a map similar to this that was bay-wide, where the elevations of shorelines were identified to determine the vulnerability of those assets. We've done something similar locally to determine the area that has the greatest level of infrastructure, and both public and private, and areas where we would see retreating from last. That's the graphic that you see here. And so we're evaluating how much additional defensive capacity we would need in order to protect these areas into the future, and other areas where we've got planned to retreat sooner rather than later. Again, that 6 feet of sea level rise showing here mapped over the downtown area. And this is essentially the strategy that we're working on currently in the draft. We've got huge areas in this zone 2 that would be retreated from earlier, that we wouldn't emphasize defense as much in this area. And then the zone 1, where we have more of that public and private infrastructure, we would see trying to defend that for a longer period of time. Now, I want to point out that this defense isn't defense at all costs. This defense comes with a lot of education, conveying the responsibility to private landowners as they come in and wish to do projects in this area, and recording notices on title so that future owners will know that this is an issue as well. Again, the 1870 shoreline mapped onto that same area. You can see that much of zone 2 theoretically is inundated. Okay, so how do we use zoning to accomplish our adaptation goals? I think a lot of the times when we think about retreat, we're thinking primarily about just moving structures out of areas that have been identified as vulnerable. In the city of Arcata, we believe that we have some time for planning a planned retreat. And so what we're doing with the coastal zoning that we've got planned for is to try and convey new uses to these sites. Right now, we have a bunch of pink sites. They're all pink. That's the color we chose for them. The pink is industrial sites. We've got a lot of industrial uses out there, and we've also got a lot of old industrial legacy, basically trucks, scrap, unknown, areas of potential contamination. And so the idea here is through the coastal zoning, we can confer new uses that have lower intensity, higher return on the investment for the people, so they're motivated to actually take on those uses. And then also dedicating areas around this perimeter so that we have an area to install this protection, an eco levee of sorts. So these are all sort of high level, sort of picking around the edges of some of the key concepts that we're trying to do with our zoning in the areas that are identified as vulnerable, to try and shift those uses away from their existing uses into new uses that were easier to retreat from. So I think that's an important lesson learned that we can incorporate in other adaptation strategies. The Gateway Area Plan is also zoning. It's an area just north of here. Again, to orient, here's Samoa Boulevard. There's the Cloverleaf. Downtown is just above there. The Gateway area involves this piece here. In our local coastal program update, proposing to rezone that to mixed use, and then a follow-on to that with the work that we're doing right now with the community is to change the zoning to reflect the work that we're doing in the Gateway area. Now, why is this important? This is important because this is outside of that area that will be inundated with 6 feet of sea level rise. And we need a place for all of those uses that we wish to locate from the vulnerable areas to land in our community. We don't want to just tell them, hey, look, you can't be here anymore. Sea level rise is coming. We're not going to allow you to renew your use. We want to actually create space within our community to relocate those uses. So the Gateway Area Plan is creating a land bank, if you will, for retreat. So I think that's another important component of the work that we're doing. I just want to close by, again, I know I'm giving you a super high level. This is kind of like, if you will, eye candy, in a sense, view into the work that we're doing in sea level rise. It's much, much more detailed than what I've been able to communicate today. But we do have ongoing engagement on this, and I'd like to invite you to sign up for e-notifications. This is a snapshot of our webpage. If you go to that landing page, on the left-hand side, you'll see this e-notification sign-up link. It's pretty straightforward to go in there and sign up for sea level rise and local coastal planning updates. You'll be notified when we're having events, when we're going to the Planning Commission, when we're going to the council, so that your voice can be heard. Again, here's my contact information. If you want to reach out to me directly and have a follow-up conversation, I'm more than happy to speak with folks about sea level rise. So with that, I'd like to close.
Thank you very much, David. I know there'll be questions at the end. Next up, Don. Are you there? You
Good
are.
afternoon, everybody. My name is Don Schmitz. I am a land use consultant. I used to work for the Coastal Commission. I was on staff in the 80s and have been a private sector consultant representing property owners, organizations, cities, and counties ever since. You know, the whole purpose of these virtual summits is to educate the general public and other experts. I have to tell you, I've facilitated a lot of these. I've been involved with coastal land use planning for a very long period of time, and I stand educated today. I think the presentations have been excellent. I've learned a couple things, and I hope everybody else is finding it helpful as well. I want to touch base on another couple quick things before we move on. The gist of my presentation is going to be to discuss what's been happening up and down the state. First of all, I'm really very deeply honored to have Commissioner Wilson here on this panel. As a veteran coastal commissioner, a local supervisor, and one of the two coastal commissioners has been entrusted with being a liaison of the working group, brings a whole wealth of knowledge and a broader perspective. And that's one of the things that I'm going to be speaking to today. And I understand the tension that Commissioner Wilson was talking about as it pertained to left to their own devices. The body politic in California realized that local jurisdictions were not dealing with the statewide issues as it pertains especially to access to the coastal zone, and the mean high tide line outward is the property of the people of the state of California after all. And so hence Prop 20 in 1972. And then of course in 1976, the legislature adopted the Coastal Act, which was because Prop 20 was sunsetting out. And one of the things that was very inherently important about the Coastal Act of 1976, which came along in 1977, was it envisioned the implementation of the Coastal Act Chapter 3 policies through a local coastal program for all 15 counties and all the cities up and down the state. And the legislature specified that there was to be a cooperative approach between the local jurisdictions and the Coastal Commission itself on the adoption of those. And there's lots of good reasons for that, which I'm not going to go into any great detail. But this has been something that the Coastal Commission's been working on for decades. And as far as sea level rise goes, the Coastal Commission has been out front and lead on a very, very, very tough subject, which is, of course, sea level rise. And what are we going to do about it? And it's a very complicated issue. So the Coastal Commission has dedicated tremendous resources and is working with these local jurisdictions. And so what I'd like to talk about, next slide, please, is how is that going? And it's a mixed bag. There's been a lot of successes, but it's been a little bit of a rocky road on some of these over the last 2 years. And I want to identify what's happening with that. I'm also fascinated by the very true statement that the North Coast is just very different. It is very different. It has options as it pertains to implementing certain things which are softer approaches that the more urbanized southern sections of the coastline really can't do. Some parts of the southern coast manage a treat where you got Pacific Coast Highway, for instance, right at your back in the ocean coming in on you. It's much more complicated than some of the rural areas. However, I would point out, I found fascinating in the presentation, especially what Alron had there, is even though probably some of the most critical infrastructure and private property resources in Humboldt County are there in the Bay, they're experiencing all of it. Groundwater rising up, wave attack coming in through the entrance to the to the bay, and of course, just inundation from rising waters. So there's been a number of LCPs that have been amended and certified. The amendment process includes it being drafted, and this is what David was discussing at the local level, then being submitted to the Coastal Commission. And by the way, it's a very complicated process at the local level. There'll be outreach hearings, a planning commission hearing, and then either the city council or the board of supervisors adopting it. The Coastal Commission staff is involved in negotiations with the local planners on trying to get it just right. And then it goes to the Coastal Commission, and you have 12 very strong personalities with broad perspectives, and each one of them has some thoughts in regards to what the appropriate LCP should look like. And there will be suggested modifications that the commission votes on, and they send it back for final adoption. That's the process. And it's been successfully implemented at Morro Bay, which was an LCPA that Smart Coast California was very supportive on. I'll embellish upon that in a moment. Half Moon Bay, San Diego County in 2021, Pacific Grove in 2020, Santa Monica in 2020, and San Francisco 2018. Everybody thinks about San Francisco as just being a bay. They sometimes forget the city of San Francisco has shoreline on the western side of the city subject to wave attack. Currently, there's a couple of them that have been submitted, Carlsbad in 2021 and Pacifica this year. Published, City of Santa Cruz, Arcata, Imperial Beach, down there by the Mexican border, Sonoma County, and Manhattan Beach. So it's out there. You can see what it is that's being envisioned. And here's a couple that's important for us to talk about, because we need to learn if our program, and we are in fact all in this together. And if our program is stumbling in some areas where that working partnership envisioned by the legislature in '76, it's not coming together, then that's something that we all need to work on. And that's one of the prime things that Smart Coast California has been working on. And that's why I have to tip my hat to Commissioner Wilson and also Commissioner Groom with the working group who are trying to bridge the gap as it pertains between some of these communities and the Coastal Commission, what they want to see. So in 2020, the city of San Clemente withdrew their local coastal program amendment, as did the city of Del Mar. And in 2021, also Santa Barbara County. And just last month, the county of Santa Cruz, their LCPA was denied. Now that's not entirely fair. The Coastal Commission in the county ran out of time. Because there's statutory limitations for it being reviewed. And the county was urged to withdraw and reapply. They declined to do that. They took it to the commission to see if they could get suggestions on how to come up with a working document, and the commission had their deliberations on that. And then there's a number of representative adaptation studies and draft LCPAs in process, and you can see them listed in the green below. Next slide, please. So submitted and published, and this is important. Some of this might be germane to Humboldt County, some of it might not. I want to show you what's coming down the pike from a number of these communities. The city of Imperial Beach, and Smart Coast California has been reviewing all these documents and submitting comments to them. The city of Carlsbad, city of Pacifica, and the city of Santa Cruz, their local coastal program, they've got their public review document as well. So a lot of the things which are coming down the pipe is a tiered response strategy for monitoring and triggers. Now understand the difficulty that local jurisdictions and the Coastal Commission deals with. We're talking about things which are decades out that may or may not happen. We're attaching probabilities, and then we need to implement regulations right now, which have real-time impacts on property owners and public infrastructure. That's because you don't want to build things which are going to require future shoreline protection devices. But at the same time, is this actually going to happen? And so the tiered response approach, which is beginning to gain a lot of favor at the local jurisdiction, and the senior Coastal Commission staff seems to have a very open mind about it, is you have certain triggers. You monitor to see what's actually going to happen. And I know some of the attendees have questions in regards to the probabilities. We're happy to answer those at the end of this presentation. Another thing that's been a huge sticking point is the definition of existing development for the local coastal program certification certification. The Coastal Commission's been taking the position that that definition of existing development means development that was in existence in 1977 when the Coastal Act became law. A lot of these local jurisdictions are saying, no, existing means existing. And this has been a point of some very, very powerful contention, which I'll embellish upon in a moment. Beach nourishment. Lots of people are looking at beach nourishment. And beach nourishment, along with dune restoration, this isn't just pumping sand on the beach, because with rising sea levels, that can erode away very quickly. But some of these dune restorations they're not your parents' sand dunes. These are sand dunes that have cobble cores, and they're kind of engineered, and then they build the sand dunes over. They're much more robust. Living shorelines. Living offshore breakwaters and artificial reefs and sand retention groins. There's a lot of different things which are getting looked at and are actually aspects of some of the pending local coastal program amendments which are coming down to the Coastal Commission now. Next slide. So here's where the wheels came off the wagon on some of these. Santa Barbara County, they withdrew in September of 2021, and in the withdrawal letter, they stated that they thought that the suggested modifications from the Coastal Commission staff impose unnecessary restrictions on coastal landowners, both public and private. Now, as an organization, we're in touch with the Board of Supervisors. We're trying to do everything that we can to bridge the gap between the Coastal Commission, its staff, and the Board of Supervisors in here. This is a very progressive, environmentally sensitive county. We got to believe that there's a solution in the offing there. Del Mar, they also withdrew, and in a presentation we did in San Diego County, Dr. Terry Gasterlin was one of the presenters, who was a council member, who stated that based upon the geomorphology of Del Mar, that if they accepted manage or treat, that 43% of the residential properties would be inundated and lost, and they simply were not willing to do that. San Clemente also withdrew their local coastal program amendment because of the 1977 date. And again, this is a very critical date under the Coastal Act, because existing development is legally entitled to a shoreline protection device. And so it's not an arcane issue. This is a very important make or break issue for a lot of these Coastal Commission jurisdictions and the Coastal Commission itself. Next slide, please. So there is a legal challenge now over this issue of what is existing development. The case is Casamera HOA versus California Coastal Commission. This was filed against the Coastal Commission for the certification of the local coastal program amendment. And the Homeowners Association, the Casamera HOA, is arguing existing means existing, and not 1977. And so I guess the reason we're putting this in there is there's probably about to be some important guidance given to us by the courts. Although I have to say that no matter what happens here, is that it's very likely that whoever wins or loses, this will be appealed. And so we're just going to have to see. You know, the Coastal Commission actually argued in litigation challenge it received in the early 2000s by a Surfrider that the definition of existing development meant existing and not 1977. There's a different perspective on that now. So it is very complicated, and I think that it's one that there ought to be extra effort given by both the Coastal Commission and local jurisdictions to see if they can come up with a meeting of the minds on this. But stay tuned. We'll keep everybody posted on what happens with the pending litigation. And Jack Ainsworth, the executive director, reported to the commission either this last hearing or hearing before on this pending case. Next slide. So the reason I asked my staff to put this LCP amendment for Morro Bay in there is because, you know, yes, we need to learn from where things are not going right, but we need to celebrate our successes as well. And Morro Bay was a local coastal program amendment that was certified in 2021. I've met with the mayor up there, and he was one of the speakers at the summit that we had in May. Great guy. But the thing that was really fascinating about Morro Bay was that it was not a one-size-fits-all. This is exactly what Commissioner Wilson was talking about. We got to get more and more granular as we learn more and more, taking even a neighborhood approach. And the thing about the Morro Bay Local Coastal Program Amendment was that they had managed retreat on the northerly part of the city facing the beach, but in their core area here, where their Embarcadero is within the bay, which is the iconic aspect of their community. It's the tourist draw. By the way, tourism, water-dependent recreational uses is a priority use under the Coastal Act. This local coastal program amendment said we are not going to engage in managed retreat in this area. If necessary, we will build taller breakwaters and bulkheads, and we will protect this core area of our Embarcadero down on the water. And so the Coastal Commission, whose perspectives and deliberations that continue to evolve and try to embrace different concepts, they certified this local coastal program. And I think that was excellent compromises on everything. And so with that, the one other aspect I would say that was very important in the Morro Bay LCPA was that they specifically put in there that should any of their regulations result in a regulatory taking, that the city would step up and they would compensate the property owners for that. So with that, I think that's my last slide. And the conclusion, of course, is no one size fits all. Do please stay focused on the needs of your local community in the more global context. Stay informed. We're here to help you with that and support your local planning agency. Thank you.
Don, thank you very much. Krista, would you just take the slide presentation down? I'm going to go ahead and go into questions. So I want to make sure we get time to answer all these questions. Before I go to the questions, there are a few other people that I would like you all to know that are on with us today, in case you have questions of them or they have responses that they'd like to answer back to some of these questions. Melissa Kramer, District Manager, North Coast District, California Coastal Commission, and she's joined by, I'm assuming, other Coastal Commission staff members. Also, Kristen Kenyon, Principal Planner of the City of Eureka. So they're here somewhere. And with any of you, as we open up these questions, if you'd like to answer or have responses back, please say so. Okay. This one is, hi, is there a written report or status on guidelines for phased approach that we could get? Anybody? Don?
No, I don't think that there is. We're sort of sorting this out as we go. There's a lot of different agencies, not just the Coastal Commission and local jurisdictions, which are looking at these different phased and tiered approaches. And I think that the tiered approach, the reason for that terminology is if this, then that. So I know that there's very often questions that pertains to how much sea level will we actually encounter and at what time? What are the probabilities of that? We've been using very conservative numbers in regards to those probabilities. So yes, I don't think that there's a template yet, but that might be something for when it comes to tiered responses, might be a good thing for the Coastal Commission, local jurisdictions, perhaps a working group to collaborate on.
Thank you. The next question, is there an order of priority for the management of sea level rise, maintaining and managing the dike and levee system, managed retreat? What are the financial impacts of the various options? Does a deeper dredge help with tidal events? Can we change? Let me roll down here. Can we change? Can we use the dredge spoils for dike maintenance? Will we be able to save the 101 corridor with raising US 101?
I can address parts of this. I think, Alderon may be better able to address some of the science that was asked there, but City of Arcata has identified sort of an order priority, at least locally. And that's sort of what the map that I showed was about, that there are areas that we think are going to be adaptable to, tidal inundation without significant financial impact. There are definitely private lands held out there, but a lot of that land is held by the city. And so we would be looking to, maintain those dikes for as long as it's feasible given the the resource lands that their current use, that threshold for feasibility is going to be a lot lower than the core zone 1 area that I showed you, where we have millions of dollars worth of infrastructure, public and private. And so you can look to our document to see about the order of priority for those. And I would say that in all cases, though, we are looking to sort of preserve the land base that we have for as long as we can, and then having that managed retreat not start when the levees are being overtopped, but have the managed retreat start now. Part of our zoning approach that I described is a component to that managed retreat to try and start changing the uses in those areas that are vulnerable. And I think that Caltrans isn't in the room, so I'm not going to speak to whether we'll be able to save the 101 corridor. That's got a series of complex triggers as well.
All right. Alderon, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I'll defer to Michael and the Caltrans representatives to address that.
Okay.
I guess I'll speak real quick to the idea of dredging to offset sea level rise. It seems like it should work that way, but it doesn't. And so, yeah, the dredging isn't going to create more volume for rising sea levels. But I think to the extent that we can use those dredge spoils for enhancing the dikes or creating new eco levees, I think that would be a beneficial reuse of those soils.
Thank you. Michael, would you like to talk to the 101 issue?
Yeah, I can't really speak to the 101 issue. I think it's being studied, but those studies haven't been released yet. I could talk to the priority of management of sea level rise planning and maintaining and managing the dike and levee system, and whether managed retreat is being proposed. Those are all discussion points, and we're hoping that with the background information that we've developed through the funding provided by the Coastal Commission, and then hopefully with the additional funding that we get, we'll be able to set up some frameworks to start figuring out the answers to those questions.
All right, thank you. Was there somebody that could or wanted to speak to the 101 issue? Commissioner Wilson, I see you unmuted yourself.
Oh, I just will say that that Caltrans is, as per the permits for their latest work, in the process of doing the planning work for their long range planning with relationship to and they've been reporting to the commission, I think annually, on their progress with relationship to that. I also want to add, there is like another sort of odd jurisdiction with relationships to levees and dikes, which are levee districts that we have. I mean, at least one, if not two, on Humboldt Bay, which can be a possible tool with relationship to how we manage those assets, or in some cases they're becoming liabilities to a certain degree. And there's now state legislation for the creation of what are called resiliency districts, I think, or something to that effect. So that there's actually ability for local jurisdictions to come together to create special districts, so that funding can be attained and or managed through local means to deal with some of these things. Again, part of this is local jurisdictions having to really address these issues, not just from the perspective of access, but also from the perspective of the future requests and with relationship to upgrades to infrastructure moving forward, and it is in the state's best interest to really ask the hard questions about how that's going to happen, because ultimately that'll probably come back with relationship to funding at the state level. And so that's one of the reasons why we're seeing some of these some of these issues playing out in this way. So
okay. All right, thank you. All right, on to the next question. I'm hearing if 2 feet sea level rise, 3 feet and even 8 feet in these presentations. What is the current best thinking on what to expect or plan for by, say, 2050? Don, do you want to?
Sure, and the others may want to weigh in on this as well. You know, the gold standard of these is NOAA and Cosmos, and that being said, it depends on which probability you pick. So you've got the extreme risk aversion, which is statistically highly unlikely. I'll get to the actual amounts in the years in a second. You got the medium to high risk aversion, which is still a 1 in 200 chance, or 99.05% chance of there being that much sea level rise. And then you've got the low risk aversion. Now, the unadopted residential guidelines from the Coastal Commission utilizes the high risk aversion, the 1 in 200 chance. And for critical infrastructure, which was adopted by the commission, they want the extreme risk aversion. And that one would have 10 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. The low risk aversion, which is statistically still unlikely, there's a 17% chance of there being that much sea level rise. By 2050 would be 1.5 feet of sea level rise. The medium to high risk aversion by 2050, which I believe was the question, would be 2.3 feet of sea level rise. So I know it can be confusing for a lot of folks to hear about all these different levels and all these different dates, but with the specificity of what it is we're talking about here and the question, which was by 2050, those are the numbers that seem to be coming out of all the best federal science that we're all operating off of.
Thanks, Don. Anybody else like to weigh in?
I'm going to just say that, you know, the commission works with all of the state agencies on this issue. And so this was our guidelines come from that effort. And if Kelsey wants to jump in, that would be awesome.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I'm Kelsey Duckle. I'm a sea level rise analyst at the Coastal Commission. Just wanted to provide a little bit more information. So there are definitely sort of different projections based on our understanding of sea level rise, and sort of it's a variety of uncertainties about what may happen. There's also uncertainty with respect to how much greenhouse gas emissions we're going to continue to have throughout the future. So that's part of why you see these different amounts of sea level rise. We do use best available science. There is updates right now, but as sort of we were saying, there's kind of narrowing in on about 1 foot to 1.5 foot by 2050. And then the further out you go, there's perhaps not surprisingly, more uncertainty with respect to what that could look like in the future. And so one of the things Don referred to, our critical infrastructure guidance, is looking at that higher scenario for those big, really important assets. And we want to have a better understanding of the risk associated with those. So that's why we're looking at some of those higher projections. I will also say that, understanding and assessing those different sea level rise amounts is different than actually building to any individual one. So we do have a sense of kind of what is the worst case scenario, what is the best case scenario, what information can that give us depending on the different type of development and the different time horizons we're looking at. So it's not a simple answer, certainly, but I think it's a really important information to have as we make these decisions for adaptation planning.
And I'd like to add that Alderon had mentioned that we're ground zero in Humboldt Bay because of subduction issues with relationship to tectonic movements that actually are measurable in these predictions. And so I don't know if Alderon has anything to add in terms of like prediction with relationship to specifically Humboldt Bay.
A lot of the current science that's being released is essentially talking about we're locked into for 6 to 10 feet of sea level rise. You can argue about when we might realize that, but that's based on the science that we currently have is that we're going to see 1, 2, 3, 6 feet of sea level rise. And so we need to plan for, for different levels, You know, if you want to put something in context with the probability, FEMA uses a 1% probability for the 100-year flood mapping and hazard mitigation planning. You know, so using the medium to high risk aversion water levels, it seems like particularly in the near term between now and 2050, we're not even considering low and high emissions in that period of time. You know, so. And what we're doing as far as greenhouse gas emissions does not give me a lot of confidence that we're achieving the low emission standards.
Thanks,
And-
Alderon.
And I just want one more word on that, which is that we also haven't in this conversation talked about storm severity and the changes in storm severity on from the upland side. So where these communities are on these coastal fringes is where the storms come and, you know, and put, you know, water into the system at these events. At the same time, we have, you know, things coming from the bottom up, and just we aren't even really necessarily talking so much about that. And ultimately, we keep assuming the same level of service and entitlement to a certain level of infrastructure and standard by which we believe we live by. And ultimately, we may have to make some adjustments to all of these things based on available land and the realistic elements of what is available and how we're going to do this. So
Yeah.
the assumption that we're moving forward in the same way that we have always in that same trajectory from a development perspective is something we need to really be thinking about.
Thanks, Commissioner. David, did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to weigh in on a couple of quick points, and I'll try and make them brief. You know, it's my understanding that the NOAA 22 report that just came out effectively, you know, recommends not using this extreme risk aversion scenario anymore. That the H++ scenario, you know, there's less confidence in it now, and so I do think that that is an interesting, you know, idea on how we readdress, you know, maybe the critical facilities guidance in light of that. And maybe to Alderon's point, you know, we're going to have some level of sea level rise for critical facilities. Maybe it's important to, you know, assume the worst case scenario. But I also think that there, you know, there's a variety of different ways of looking at, you know, the greenhouse gas impacts on the climate. And I recently listened to a New York Times article that was very well researched. That was actually, you know, gives me a lot of hope. I mean, I think a lot of the times we talk about, you know, sea level rise and greenhouse gases, and we're, you know, focused on sort of the worst case scenario, and it's pretty dour and you know, dire predictions and that sort of thing. So I'd encourage folks to take a look. This was just in the last month, New York Times article on sea level rise, and one of the take homes that I got from that is, you know, sort of the rates of production of, you know, alternative fuels, the rates of advances in battery technology, you know, the ability to, you know, continue to streamline these things. I think we are going to have an impact. Is it going to be enough soon enough? I mean, it's not going to feel like it, certainly, but we also have seen in history, you know, pretty rapid advances in technology that have broad-ranging implications. I think this is a serious enough problem that the world is taking seriously, that we're going to see those kinds of advances. And so I think that, you know, it's important to understand the amount of greenhouse gases that are baked into the atmosphere that are going to, you know, what that impact is. But I also think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, the RCP 8.5 scenario that we're all using as sort of the worst case scenario assumes a level of, you know, inputs of greenhouse gases that are probably unrealistic based on the resources that we have available to us now and the changes in technology for those fuel switching. So just wanted to put a bright spot in the room here before we close.
Thank you. I'll go on to the next question, but I just wanted to say one thing. I think part of the concern that we have is if we focus on the date of when we think it's going to happen by, we're going to get caught having it already have happened. So to work off of whatever that level is now and start now and have it ready for 2050 or whenever it may be is the way we really need to be focused on. The next question. Why overpopulate, overbuild at the gateway zone in Arcata when we already know the sea level rise situation will limit public access to the area as well as service to the same? Why not develop areas outside of this problem area in the rural areas of this huge county, or in abandoned areas in towns like McKinleyville, Kmart Shopping Center, or many abandoned Eureka sites?
Yeah, again, I'm not sure that I agree with the premise of the question that we already know that these areas are going to be inaccessible. So I think to reflect on, how, at the end of the day, greenhouse gases is what's causing this. The more we sprawl, the more we have to, rely on vehicles to get us around. The more greenhouse gases there are, the more of this problem we have. And so, I think the message that I just sent out about, fuel switching, the ideas that infill development is going to reduce those greenhouse gases, those are well accepted principles of climate adaptation. And so, in brief, that's why.
Thank you. Anybody else? All right, on to the next one. Does the Coastal Commission have a policy that requires cities and counties to update a certified local coastal program periodically to accommodate sea level rise effects? It seems backwards for Arcata to adopt the Gateway Area Plan before updating the LCP.
Yeah, well, we've got coastal staff here that I'm sure would be interested in weighing in on that. But I will say that the Coastal Act itself envisions that all local coastal programs would be reviewed, amended, and updated every 5 years. Of course, the Coastal Act also envisioned that every community, county, and city in the state of California would have a certified LCP by 1981. And we didn't make that, not by a long shot. And so there's also the aspect in regards to the Coastal Commission can't really compel local jurisdictions to do this. So they've tried to entice local jurisdictions. Some have been very willing, some not so much. And so the governor and the legislature have given grant money that the Coastal Commission can distribute to the local jurisdictions so that they can do these studies, these vulnerability assessments, so that they can do the wordsmithing. So it's been, the state of California has put the money where their mouth is on this. There still is some real tension between some of these jurisdictions and the Coastal Commission, and that's why you've seen the withdrawals. So yes, they're supposed to be amended every 5 years. There was a bill, oh gosh, I'm embarrassed, I can't remember the lawmaker, that the governor just vetoed a bill that was going to basically require every local coastal program to be amended by 2031 or 2032. The governor vetoed it because, not that his heart wasn't in it, but it wasn't funded. He vetoed a lot of bills that didn't have the funding because the tax base was shrinking down. So there's a strong commitment in Sacramento. There's a strong commitment in the local regional offices of the Coastal Commission. There's a requirement that they're supposed to be reviewing these. Before sea level rise was something that we were even focusing on. Remember, this is something we really started focusing on in the state about 10 years ago. They're supposed to be reviewed every 5 years, but there's no real enforcement hook on that for the Coastal Commission or the state to compel the counties and the cities to do so.
Commissioner Wilson?
I was thinking that maybe Melissa might have something to say about this. No, or
Don gave a really great answer, so I don't have anything to add.
all right.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so we're nearing our 4:30 mark. I'm going to try to get through a couple more. We're going to go a little bit over what we had scheduled for 4:30. We're not going to get all these questions answered, and I apologize. You guys have given us some great questions. It appears the threat to the dirty nuclear power waste stored 115 feet underground from rising tides would be the most important issue to direct funds from, or to direct funds to. Any questions or any comments on that?
It's not 115 feet underground. It's 115 feet back from the rock fortification. So if the bluff retreats by 115 feet, it would expose the nuclear storage caskets.
Ugh.
I could also point out that the Department of Energy actually owns those casks of stored nuclear fuel, and there's an agreement that they be removed from that site by 2030. They missed the previous deadline. It seems unlikely that they'll be able to hit this deadline, but there is an effort to move those casks and some agreements in place to move those casks from that site.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's efforts, and with relationship to prioritization, I mean, funding doesn't just go all in one direction or all in another direction, and doesn't all come from one source. And so the efforts around this, again, as Michael mentioned, have a federal nexus, and that federal nexus is where the material is going to go, or where it even could go. And there are some efforts to collaborate with other communities up and down California, on the California coast, and specifically those that have these waste issues as well. There's a couple of them with these sites, and figure out maybe there's some other way to deal with this other than waiting for the federal government to come up with a central repository.
Thank you. All right. I've heard that the Coastal Commission might accept existing development as of the date of permit application if the locals accept redevelopment policies from that date on. Any truth?
I can't speak to pending or future policy decisions of the Coastal Commission, and just to be, so I don't know. I really couldn't tell you.
Thank you.
If there's staff that have.
If I could jump in really quick, I'm also not able to actually answer that question. I will say one of the things the local government working group has talked about is, are there opportunities to better address just generally how and where armoring can be used as a potential strategy, which sort of gets a little bit away from that specific definition, just sort of in generally in terms of how we're approaching sea level rise adaptation. So that might be a little bit of an answer. Thank
you. All right, we've run out of time. These questions that have not been answered in the chat, we're able to save those, and we will try to get those to the people that we feel would be most directed to, and try to get answers for you. Krista, you want to just bring up just a couple of slides to close out? First off, thank you all so much to all of you that came in and spoke with us today. Thank you for your time. I know how busy you all are, but like somebody said, maybe David earlier on, by the showing here today, this just shows how important this all is to us. This is the one reason why Smart Coast was developed, why we were created, to bring this type of communication together, to be able to all come to a table and sit down together and talk, not necessarily go away and agree with everything that we're sharing, but at least hear the different sides and maybe glean a little bit from each thing, and be able to come up with something that's going to help save our coastline, our communities, infrastructures for decades and decades to come. So for all of that, thank you very much. Dawn has already talked about a lot of the long-term and short-term solutions that we have. Krista, next slide. I'm not going to spend any time on this. Dawn touched on all of this. There's a lot of these solutions that Smart Coast has presented in policies that are on our website if you'd like to have more information about them. Next slide. This is something that we're kind of hanging our feather on. The Resilience Imperial Beach, part of their LCP, named Smart Coast in their policy, printed and forever sealed. So we're very proud of this. We're very proud that Smart Coast had a part to play in the development of their local coastal plan. Next slide. Connect with us. Our website, you get the QR code for the website. The gold QR code is our newsletter. This newsletter will tell you all of the happenings that are going on monthly. It'll tell you where we're going to be. It'll tell you what's going on with the local coastal plans up and down the coast. It'll tell you when the Coastal Commission meetings are going to be. Anything that you need to have will be on that newsletter. Next page. Thank you all very much. We really appreciate your time. Commissioner Wilson, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank
Very
you.
much.
Thank you very much for having us here from Humboldt County. I do want to say that we don't have no implied association or support with relationship to Smart Coast other than to be available to you in these events. And I will speak for the staff of the commission as well as the county with relationship to that. And I think David Loya also probably feels the same way. We're happy to be here, but again, we want to make sure that our comments and statements and representation here is separate from the organization that puts this forward. So
Totally understand.
thank you.
We love having you at the table. Awesome. Well, thank you all. Dawn, thank you for being here.